The room was suffocatingly still, the air thick with the scent of candle wax and desperation. In a dim corner of a crumbling Baltimore row house, a man knelt on a threadbare rug, his trembling hands clutching a rosary so tightly that his knuckles bled. His lips moved in a frenzied whisper, not with prayer but with a voice that wasn't his own, a guttural, jagged chant that seemed to claw its way out of his throat. "You are not welcome here," he hissed, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at a mirror propped against the wall. But the reflection staring back wasn't just his. Something else flickered in the glass, something that made his heart pound with a terror so raw it could shatter bones. This was no ordinary night in 1994. This was the night Daniel Carver began a ritual that would consume him. A ritual he believed was ordered by God himself. A command to exorcise the demon he swore lived inside his own soul. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's a descent into the fractured mind of a man who believed he was chosen, a man whose devotion turned into a chilling obsession that would unravel his life and haunt everyone around him. This is the story of Daniel Carver, a quiet, unassuming factory worker from Maryland, whose life took a turn so bizarre, so unsettling, that it still sends shivers through those who dare to speak his name. What drove a man to perform endless exorcisms on himself night after night, until his body and mind were unrecognizable? Was he truly hearing the voice of God, or was something far darker whispering in his ear? And what secret, buried deep in his past, would emerge to reveal a truth so disturbing it would make you question the very nature of faith, madness, and the human soul? From the first moment you hear this, you'll feel it, the weight of a story that's as gripping as it is terrifying. It's the kind of tale that makes you lock your doors at night, not because you fear what's outside, but because you start to wonder what might be hiding within you. Daniel's story isn't just about one man's unraveling. It's a mirror held up to the fragility of our own minds, showing how easily belief can twist into something unrecognizable. How does a man go from being a devout Catholic, known for his gentle smile and quiet charity, to a figure so consumed by his own rituals that he became a ghost in his own life? What did he see in that mirror that made him believe he was no longer human? And why, even now, do some in his hometown whisper that his rituals might have awakened something real, something that lingers still? This case will pull you into a world where the line between divine and deranged blurs, where every answer raises a new question, and where the truth is so elusive it might just slip through your fingers. Stay with us until the end, because what you'll discover will challenge everything you think you know about the human mind and the forces that drive it to the edge. This is not a story for the faint of heart. It's a journey into a darkness that feels all too close, all too possible. And the questions it raises will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. What would you do if you heard a voice claiming to be God? Would you listen? Would you obey? Or would you fight to silence it, even if it meant destroying yourself? Let's pause for a moment to connect with this story on a deeper level. If you're ready to dive into this unsettling mystery, hit that like button right now. It's your way of signaling that you're not afraid to uncover the hidden truths behind cases like Daniel's. Your like helps spread this story to others who crave the strange and the inexplicable, ensuring these dark secrets don't stay buried. And in the comments, leave the phrase, "I'm ready to discover the truth about this story." By doing so, you're not just watching. You're joining a community of truth seekers, people who dare to look into the shadows and ask the questions no one else will. Your comment is your pledge to stay with us, to unravel the enigma of Daniel Carver together. Thank you for being here, for being part of this journey into the unknown. You're not just a viewer, you're one of us, a seeker of the stories that others are too afraid to tell. Now brace yourself. What comes next is a revelation that will change how you see faith, fear, and the fragile boundaries of the human mind forever. Daniel Carver's story is about to unfold, and it's unlike anything you've ever heard. The autumn of 1994 draped Baltimore in a haze of amber leaves and early dusk. But for Daniel Carver, the world was already growing dimmer. At 34, he was a man of routine. 6 days a week at the steel mill, Sundays at St. Agnes Catholic Church, where he knelt in the same pew, third row from the back, his head bowed in quiet reverence. To his neighbors, he was unremarkable. A lean man with tired eyes and a soft voice, always ready with a nod or a dollar for the church's charity box. But something was shifting inside him, something no one else could see. It began with a sound, a faint murmur, like wind rustling through a distant forest, that came to him one night as he lay in his narrow bed. At first he thought it was the creak of the old row house settling, or maybe the hum of the city beyond his window, but the sound grew sharper, more distinct, until it formed words. "Daniel," it said low and clear, as if spoken from the foot of his bed. "I am with you." He sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was empty, the shadows still. He checked the locks, peered out the window into the alley below. Nothing. Just the flicker of a street lamp and the distant bark of a dog. He told himself it was a dream, a trick of an overworked mind. But the next night it came again, stronger this time, like a voice pressed against his ear. "Daniel, you are chosen." His hands shook as he clutched his rosary, whispering prayers to drown it out. But the words seemed to weave through his own, insistent, unyielding. He didn't tell anyone, not his co-workers, not Father Brennan at St. Agnes, not even his sister Marie, who called every Sunday to check on him. To speak of it felt like betraying a secret, one that was his alone to carry. Yet the voice was relentless, returning each night with a clarity that made his skin prickle. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, warm and heavy, filling the room like a tide. By October, the voice began to give commands. Small at first. "Pray for the lost," it urged, and Daniel complied, spending hours on his knees, his lips moving through litanies until his voice cracked. Then, "Give all you have," it said, and he emptied his savings, $2,300, every cent from years of overtime, into the church's collection plate, leaving his account barren. His co-workers noticed his gaunt face, the way his hands trembled as he operated the mill's machinery, but he brushed off their concern with a weak smile. "Just tired," he'd say, though his eyes darted to corners as if searching for something no one else could see. At home, alone, he began to feel watched, not by the neighbors or the stray cats in the alley, but by something closer, something inside. The voice grew more specific. "Cleanse yourself, Daniel. You are not pure." He scrubbed his skin raw in the shower, fasted until his ribs pressed against his flesh. But the voice was never satisfied. It was as if it knew him better than he knew himself, peeling back layers of his soul to expose flaws he couldn't name. One night, as a storm battered the city, the voice took a darker turn. "There is evil within you," it said, each syllable sharp as a blade. Daniel froze, his breath catching. He'd always believed in the devil, in the way Father Brennan spoke of temptation as a shadow waiting to slip into unguarded hearts. But this felt different, personal, intimate. He stumbled to the bathroom, staring into the chipped mirror above the sink. His reflection looked wrong, his eyes too wide, his mouth twisted in a way that wasn't his. "You must cast it out," the voice commanded, and Daniel's hands moved almost on their own, reaching for the leather-bound Bible on his nightstand. He flipped to the passages on exorcism, the ones he'd heard in church but never truly studied, his fingers trembling as he traced the words. That night he performed his first ritual, sprinkling salt around his bed, reciting prayers in a voice that quavered with both fear and conviction. He felt the voice quiet, just for a moment, and a wave of relief washed over him. But it was fleeting. By dawn it was back, stronger, mocking. "You cannot hide from me." What Daniel didn't know, what no one could have known, was that this was only the beginning. The voice wasn't just a fleeting hallucination or a product of exhaustion. It was the first thread in a tapestry of obsession that would unravel his life, pulling him into a world where faith and fear became indistinguishable. His neighbors began to notice strange noises from his house, low chants, the clatter of objects falling in the night. Marie, on her next call, heard a tremor in his voice she couldn't place, a distance that made her heart sink. And at St. Agnes, Father Brennan began to wonder why Daniel no longer lingered after Mass, why his eyes avoided the crucifix above the altar. Something was taking hold of Daniel Carver, something that would soon draw others into its shadow, forcing them to confront questions they weren't ready to answer. Was this God's will, or something far more sinister? And what did it mean for a man to exorcise himself night after night, chasing a demon that might not even exist? By November 1994, Daniel Carver's row house had become a fortress of shadows. The windows, once open to catch the breeze off the Patapsco River, were now draped with heavy blankets, pinned tightly to block out the world. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of melted wax and incense, the floor littered with salt and crumpled pages torn from hymnals. Daniel no longer slept more than an hour or two, his nights consumed by the voice that had taken root in his mind. "Cleanse it all," it demanded, and he obeyed, transforming his home into a shrine of desperate rituals. He'd arranged candles in precise circles on the floor, their flames casting flickering shapes that seemed to dance with a life of their own. The mirror in the bathroom where he'd first seen that twisted reflection was now covered with a black cloth, but he could still feel its pull, as if something on the other side was watching, waiting. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, relentless and precise. "You are defiled," it told him, "but I will guide you." Daniel clung to the idea that this was God speaking, testing his faith as he had tested Job. He spent hours scouring his Bible, annotating passages with trembling hands, convinced the answers lay in the words of Matthew or Mark. He began to write his own prayers, feverish lines scratched onto scraps of paper. "Deliver me from the shadow within. Make me worthy." He recited them in a low, rhythmic chant, his voice echoing through the empty house. The rituals grew more elaborate, sprinkling holy water he'd taken from St. Agnes, burning sage until the smoke stung his eyes, fasting for days until his body swayed with weakness. Each act felt like a step closer to salvation, but the voice was never satisfied. "More," it urged. "You must do more." His life outside the house began to crumble. At the steel mill, Daniel's hands, once steady, now fumbled with the machinery. He'd stare blankly at the glowing furnace, as if seeing something beyond the flames. His foreman, a gruff man named Eddie, pulled him aside one day. "You sick, Carver? You look like you ain't slept in a month." Daniel muttered something about a cold, but his eyes betrayed him. Wild, darting as if tracking an invisible threat. He stopped joining the crew for beers after shifts, stopped answering Marie's calls. When she left voicemails, her voice tight with worry, he listened in silence, unable to explain the weight pressing down on him. The voice had warned him, "Speak to no one. They will not understand." And he believed it, isolating himself from the world that once anchored him. The rituals began to bleed into his days. He'd sneak away during lunch breaks to mutter prayers in the mill's storage room, his fingers tracing the rosary beads hidden in his pocket. At home, he constructed an altar in his living room, a wooden table draped with a white cloth adorned with a crucifix, candles, and a small vial of oil he'd blessed himself. He'd kneel before it for hours, his knees bruised against the hardwood, reciting exorcism rites he'd pieced together from books and half-remembered sermons. "In the name of the Father I cast you out," he'd say, his voice rising, sweat beading on his forehead. He wasn't just praying now, he was fighting, battling something he couldn't see but felt in every fiber of his being. The voice responded, sometimes mocking, sometimes encouraging, but always there, a constant companion in his solitude. One night, as a cold rain lashed the city, Daniel reached a new threshold. The voice had grown louder, more insistent. "You must face it, Daniel. Look within." He tore the cloth from the bathroom mirror, his breath catching as he stared into his own eyes. They seemed hollow, not his own, and for a moment he swore he saw a shadow move behind his reflection, a formless thing that pulsed with malice. His heart raced as he began the ritual again, this time louder, more desperate, splashing holy water on the glass and pressing the crucifix against his chest. "Leave me," he shouted, his voice cracking. The mirror trembled, or perhaps it was his own shaking hands, but he felt a surge of triumph as if he'd pushed something back. But the victory was fleeting. By morning, the voice was there again, whispering, "You cannot win alone." The neighbors began to talk. Mrs. Kowalski, who lived next door, heard the chants through the thin walls, saw the strange glow of candlelight seeping under Daniel's door. She knocked one evening, a plate of pierogies in hand, hoping to check on him. He opened the door just a crack, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot. "I'm fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, before shutting the door. She told her husband it was like looking at a stranger. At St. Agnes, Father Brennan noticed Daniel's absence from Mass, the empty pew a silent alarm. He called the house, but the phone rang, unanswered. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but no one knew how to reach the man who was slipping away, consumed by a battle only he could see. The voice was winning, pulling Daniel deeper into a world where faith and fear were one, setting the stage for a moment that would soon shake those around him to their core. Winter's chill had settled over Baltimore by December 1994, and Daniel Carver's row house stood like a tomb against the gray sky. The blankets over the windows were tattered now, letting slivers of pale light pierce the gloom within. Inside, the air was heavy with the acrid tang of burnt herbs and the faint metallic scent of blood. Daniel's knuckles, raw from gripping his rosary, left smears on the pages of his Bible. The voice in his head had become a constant roar, no longer content with whispers. "You are failing," it taunted, each word a needle in his mind. The evil grows stronger. Daniel's rituals, once confined to nights, now consumed every waking moment. He hadn't been to the steel mill in weeks. His absence noted with a curt termination letter slipped under his door. He didn't care. The world beyond his walls felt distant, irrelevant, a distraction from the war he was waging against the darkness he believed lived inside him. His altar had grown, sprawling across the living room like a living thing. Candles, now dozens, burned in uneven rows, their wax pooling into strange shapes on the floor. He'd added relics, a lock of his late mother's hair, a chipped saint's medal, a vial of water from a pilgrimage he'd never taken. He knelt before it for hours, his body swaying, chanting words that blended Latin from old prayer books with his own fevered inventions. "Ego te expello," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I cast you out." But the voice in his head laughed, a low guttural sound that made his stomach churn. "You cannot cast out what is part of you," it said, and Daniel's hands shook as he pressed the crucifix to his forehead, hard enough to bruise. He was no longer sure where his thoughts ended and the voice began. It felt like it was rewriting him, erasing the man he'd been. The outside world began to intrude, despite his efforts to shut it out. Marie, his sister, drove from Annapolis after weeks of unanswered calls, her worry turning to dread. She stood outside his door, pounding until her fists ached, her voice breaking as she called his name. "Danny, please, just talk to me. Please." Through the crack under the door, she smelled something sour, saw the flicker of candlelight. When Daniel finally opened the door just enough to show his face, Marie gasped. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes hollowed out, ringed with shadows. His hair, once neatly combed, hung in greasy strands. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat, but his gaze darted past her, as if expecting someone, or something else. She tried to push past him to see inside, but he blocked her, his grip on the doorframe unyielding. "Go home, Marie," he said, and the door slammed shut. She stood there frozen, the winter wind biting at her tears. At St. Agnes, Father Brennan was growing alarmed. He'd heard whispers from parishioners about Daniel. Strange noises, lights burning at all hours, the way he'd stopped coming to church. He visited the row house, clutching his coat against the cold, and knocked softly. Daniel didn't answer, but Father Brennan heard a low chant from within, words he couldn't make out but that sent a chill down his spine. He left a note, urging Daniel to come to the rectory to talk, to pray together. The note went unanswered, stuffed into a pile of unopened mail. The priest confided in a colleague, Father Michael, who frowned and mentioned stories of possession, of men driven mad by their own faith. "He needs help," Father Michael said, "but not the kind we can give." Father Brennan nodded, but his heart sank. He'd seen Daniel's quiet devotion for years. How could it have come to this? Inside the house, Daniel's rituals reached a fever pitch. The voice had given him a new command. "Mark yourself as mine." He hesitated, his hands trembling as he held a small knife, its blade catching the candlelight. The voice was insistent, promising release if he obeyed. Late one night, he stood before the covered mirror, his breath ragged, and carved a small cross into his forearm, wincing as blood welled up. The pain was sharp, but it felt holy, like a sacrifice that might finally silence the voice. For a moment, it did. The silence was so profound he wept, sinking to his knees. But by dawn, the voice returned, angrier, demanding more. "You are not enough," it said, and Daniel's heart sank. He began to see the demon everywhere, in the shadows on the walls, in the flicker of the candles, in the way his own hands moved as if guided by another. He stopped eating entirely, surviving on water, and the occasional bite of bread, convinced that food might feed the evil within. The breaking point came on a frigid night when the power in his neighborhood flickered out. In the darkness, the voice screamed, "Now, Daniel! Face it now!" He tore the cloth from the mirror, his reflection lit only by the candle's glow. What he saw made his blood run cold. His face, but not his face. Eyes too large, a mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't his. He screamed, smashing the mirror with his fist, glass shattering across the floor. Blood dripped from his hand, mixing with the wax, and he fell to his knees, chanting louder, faster, as if the words could hold back the terror. The voice laughed, and Daniel knew he was losing. The war inside him was no longer his to fight alone, but who could he turn to when the enemy was himself? The shattered mirror lay in jagged pieces across Daniel Carver's bathroom floor, glinting faintly in the candlelight like the remnants of a broken promise. It was mid-December 1994, and Baltimore's streets were dusted with snow, but inside Daniel's row house, the air was stifling, thick with the residue of his endless rituals. The voice in his head had not relented since the night he smashed the mirror. It was louder now, a cacophony that drowned out his own thoughts. "You cannot escape," it hissed, and Daniel believed it. His body was wasting away, his skin stretched tight over bones, his eyes sunken into dark hollows. The small cross he'd carved into his forearm was scabbed over, but he'd begun tracing it with his fingers during his chants, as if it tethered him to the divine mission he still clung to. Yet the world outside his walls was no longer content to let him fight his battle alone. His isolation was cracking, and the fear he'd sown was spreading. Mrs. Kowalski, the neighbor who'd once brought him pierogies, now crossed the street to avoid his house. The chants that echoed through the walls had grown louder, more erratic, sometimes punctuated by cries that made her heart race. She'd told the other neighbors, Mr. Ruiz, who lived across the alley, and the young couple, the Harrisons, who'd just moved in. They'd all heard things: the rhythmic muttering, the occasional crash, the strange glow that flickered through the gaps in Daniel's covered windows. Mr. Ruiz swore he'd seen Daniel standing in his backyard at midnight, staring at the sky, motionless, as if listening to something no one else could hear. "He's not right," Ruiz whispered at a neighborhood watch meeting, his voice low. "It's like he's not even there anymore." The Harrisons, unnerved, started locking their doors at night, something they'd never done in their old suburb. The street, once a tight-knit row of working-class families, now buzzed with unease, Daniel's house at the center of their whispered fears. Marie, Daniel's sister, couldn't stay away any longer. After her last visit, when he'd shut her out, she'd called every day, her voicemails growing more desperate. She'd even contacted the steel mill, only to learn he'd been fired weeks ago. On a snowy evening, she drove back to Baltimore, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she rehearsed what she'd say. When she reached his door, she knocked, then pounded, her breath visible in the cold air. "Danny, I'm not leaving!" she shouted. The door creaked open, and there he was, thinner than ever, his shirt hanging loose, his eyes wild but distant, like a man staring through a fog. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely audible. She pushed past him, ignoring his weak protest, and gasped at the state of the house. Candles burned everywhere, their wax pooling on the floor. The air smelled of decay, and papers covered with frantic handwriting were scattered across the room. "What is this, Danny?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, just stared at the altar, his lips moving silently. Marie's fear turned to action. She called Father Brennan, who arrived the next morning with Father Michael in tow. The priest stood outside, hesitant, the wind carrying the faint sound of Daniel's chants through the walls. Father Brennan knocked, his heart heavy. When Daniel opened the door, his face was a mask of exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a fervor that made Father Michael step back. "We're worried about you, Daniel," Father Brennan said gently. "Let us help." Daniel shook his head, his voice sharp. "This is God's work, you don't understand." He shut the door, leaving the priests standing in the snow. Father Michael, who'd studied cases of religious obsession, whispered, "He's not possessed. He's sick." But Father Brennan wasn't so sure. He'd seen Daniel's faith pure and steady for years. This wasn't just illness. It was something deeper, something that blurred the line between devotion and delusion. The neighborhood's fear began to ripple outward. A local reporter, tipped off by a neighbor, started asking questions, sniffing out a story about the crazy man on Pratt Street. The police were called once after Mrs. Kowalski reported a scream, but they found nothing. Just Daniel sitting calmly at his altar, denying anything was wrong. "Just praying," he told the officer, his voice steady but his hands shaking. The officer left, uneasy, noting the strange symbols drawn in chalk on the floor. Word spread, and soon, kids on the block dared each other to knock on Daniel's door, running away giggling, unaware of the torment inside. But one person wasn't running: Marie. She refused to give up, returning day after day, leaving food at his doorstep, though it went untouched. She began to research, poring over library books on mental illness, possession, and religious mania, searching for answers to what was consuming her brother. Inside, Daniel's rituals were spiraling. The voice now demanded blood, not just the small cut on his arm, but something more. "Prove your faith," it said, and he began to mark his body with more crosses, shallow cuts that stung but felt righteous. He stopped sleeping entirely, convinced the demon thrived in his dreams. His chants grew louder, more desperate, filling the house with a rhythm that felt alive like a pulse. One night as a storm raged outside, he heard the voice say something new. "Bring another." The words stopped him cold, his hands frozen over the altar. For the first time he wondered if this was God at all, or something else, something that wanted more than his soul. The thought was fleeting, drowned out by the voice's insistence, but it planted a seed of doubt, a crack in the foundation of his obsession that would soon draw others into his nightmare. The snow fell heavier in Baltimore as Christmas 1994 approached, blanketing the city in a deceptive calm. But inside Daniel Carver's row house, there was no peace, only the relentless drumbeat of his rituals. The voice in his head had become a tyrant, its commands growing sharper, more invasive. "Bring another," it repeated, the words looping through his mind like a hymn he couldn't unlearn. Daniel's body was a map of his desperation, shallow crosses etched into his arms and chest, his skin pale from days without food, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. The altar in his living room had grown chaotic, cluttered with melted candles, scraps of paper inscribed with prayers, and a single photograph of his mother, her face half obscured by wax. He no longer questioned the voice's divinity. He obeyed it, convinced it was God's will, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. But the command to bring another was different, a line he hadn't yet crossed, and it filled him with a dread he couldn't name. Outside, the neighborhood's fear had hardened into suspicion. The stories about Daniel had spread beyond Pratt Street, whispered in corner stores and church basements. Some called him a hermit, others a fanatic, but a few, like Mrs. Kowalski, began to wonder if something supernatural was at play. She'd seen him once, late at night, standing in his backyard, his lips moving as if speaking to the air. It wasn't human the way he looked, she told the Harrisons, her voice trembling. The local reporter, a young woman named Clara Hensley, had started digging deeper, piecing together fragments from neighbors and Daniel's former co-workers. She knocked on his door one evening, notepad in hand, but Daniel didn't answer. The faint sound of chanting leaked through the walls and Clara left, her curiosity tinged with unease. She didn't know it yet, but her interest would soon pull her closer to Daniel's world than she could imagine. Marie, meanwhile, was unraveling in her own way. She'd taken a leave from her job in Annapolis, spending hours at the library, her notes a tangle of medical terms and religious texts. She'd learned about schizophrenia, about auditory hallucinations, but the clinical explanations felt hollow against the memory of her brother's fervent eyes. She'd also read about exorcism, about cases where faith and madness collided, and the stories chilled her. She reached out to Father Brennan again, begging him to intervene. "He's not himself," she said, her voice breaking over the phone. Father Brennan promised to try, but he was torn. Daniel's faith had always been his strength, and the priest couldn't shake the fear that interfering might break him further. Still, he agreed to meet Marie at the row house, bringing Father Michael, who'd begun to suspect Daniel's condition was beyond spiritual guidance. It was during this fragile moment that someone new entered Daniel's orbit, someone who would change the course of his descent. His name was Thomas Reed, a drifter who'd arrived in Baltimore that winter, drawn by whispers of a man touched by God. Thomas was a wiry man in his late 20s with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to see too much. He'd been raised in a Pentecostal commune, steeped in tales of miracles and demons, and had spent years wandering, chasing stories of the divine. When he heard about Daniel from a barfly at a dive near the docks, he felt a pull, as if drawn by a beacon. Thomas knocked on Daniel's door one icy afternoon, his breath clouding in the cold. When Daniel opened it, wary and gaunt, Thomas smiled, his voice soft but fervent. "I know what you're fighting," he said. "I've seen it before. Let me help." Daniel hesitated, the voice in his head snarling, "He lies." But Thomas's words carried a strange weight, an echo of the conviction Daniel had once felt in church. Against his instincts, he let Thomas inside. The drifter stepped into the cluttered house, his eyes scanning the altar, the salt circles, the blood-streaked rosary. He didn't flinch. "You're doing God's work," Thomas said, kneeling beside the altar as if it were his own. He spoke of demons he'd seen in his travels, of battles fought in the name of faith. Daniel listened, his heart pounding. For the first time in months, he felt seen, understood. The voice was silent as Thomas spoke, and Daniel took it as a sign. "Stay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas nodded, his smile unreadable. Thomas began joining Daniel's rituals, chanting alongside him, his voice blending with Daniel's in a strange harmony. He brought new elements, herbs Daniel didn't recognize, prayers in a tongue that sounded ancient. "This is how we draw it out," Thomas said, his eyes gleaming. Daniel followed, desperate for relief, but the voice grew louder in Thomas's presence, its commands more urgent. "He is not yours," it warned, and Daniel's doubt returned, sharper now. Who was Thomas, really? Why had he come? As the two men knelt before the altar, the candles casting long shadows, Marie and Father Brennan were planning their own intervention, unaware of the stranger who'd slipped into Daniel's world. The stage was set for a collision, one that would push Daniel's fragile mind to the edge of a truth he wasn't ready to face. The final days of December 1994 cloaked Baltimore in a bitter cold, the kind that seeped into bones and made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Inside Daniel Carver's row house, the air was hotter, heavier, thick with the smoke of strange herbs Thomas Reed had brought, mugwort and myrrh, he claimed, to bind the demon. The altar had grown wilder, a chaotic shrine of candles. Bones, Thomas said, were from a sacred site, and pages of Daniel's scrawled prayers, now mixed with Thomas's angular script. The two men knelt side by side, their voices weaving through chants that echoed into the night. Daniel's body was a wreck, his skin sallow, his arms crisscrossed with scabbed cuts, his ribs stark against his chest. The voice in his head was relentless, its commands now a storm. "He is not yours. Cast him out." But Thomas's presence was a strange anchor, his fervent eyes and steady voice convincing Daniel that together they could defeat the evil within him. Yet beneath this fragile alliance a shadow of doubt was growing, one that threatened to unravel everything. Thomas was a mystery, his past a patchwork of half-told stories. He spoke of visions he'd had as a child, of a preacher who'd taught him to see the unseen. He claimed to have faced demons before, in a Kansas town where a woman had screamed in tongues, and in a Louisiana swamp where a man had burned his own house to cleanse the air. Daniel listened, hungry for proof that his battle wasn't madness, but the voice in his head hissed warnings. "He lies," it said, and Daniel's hands trembled as he lit another candle. Thomas seemed to sense the doubt, his voice growing sharper during their rituals. "You have to trust me, Daniel," he'd say, his hand gripping Daniel's shoulder. "The demon wants you to turn away." Daniel nodded, but the voice's warnings lingered, a splinter in his mind. Was Thomas his salvation or something else? Something the voice feared, or worse, something it wanted. Outside, the world was closing in. Marie had enlisted Father Brennan and Father Michael for a final attempt to reach her brother. She'd spent sleepless nights poring over her notes, torn between medical explanations and the chilling possibility that Daniel's torment was spiritual. She'd found a psychiatrist, Dr. Helen Voss, who specialized in religious delusions, and convinced her to consult on the case. The four met at St. Agnes, their faces grim as Marie described Daniel's state. The altar, the chants, the way his eyes no longer seemed his own. Dr. Voss listened, her expression calm, but her notes meticulous. "It sounds like a severe psychotic break," she said. "Possibly schizophrenia, triggered by stress or trauma." Father Michael nodded, but Father Brennan hesitated, his faith wrestling with the clinical words. "He believes it's God," he said softly. "What if there's more to it?" Marie's voice broke as she spoke. "I just want my brother back." They agreed to confront Daniel together, to force him to see reason, or to face whatever was consuming him. The neighborhood, too, was restless. Clara Hensley, the reporter, had pieced together enough to write a story, but her editor hesitated. It was too strange, too unverified. Still, she kept watch, parking her car down the street, noting the strange man who now came and went from Daniel's house. She'd seen Thomas once slipping out at dawn, his coat pulled tight, his face unreadable. She jotted down his description, her instincts telling her he was key to the story. Meanwhile, the neighbors' fear had turned to action. Mr. Ruiz organized a petition to have Daniel's house inspected, citing disturbances. Mrs. Kowalski, though hesitant, signed it, her guilt tempered by the memory of Daniel's hollow gaze. The police were called again after a neighbor reported a strange smell, but they found nothing, just Daniel and Thomas, kneeling at the altar, their chants unbroken. Inside, Daniel's doubt was becoming a chasm. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, Thomas led a new ritual, one he said would break the demon's hold. He handed Daniel a vial of dark liquid, claiming it was blessed oil from a mystic he'd met in Georgia. "Drink it," Thomas urged, his eyes intense. The voice screamed in Daniel's head, "Poison!" and he froze, the vial trembling in his hand. He stared at Thomas, searching for truth in his face, but saw only a flicker of something, anger or fear. "Do it, Daniel," Thomas pressed, his voice low. Daniel set the vial down, his heart pounding. "I need a sign," he whispered, and Thomas's jaw tightened. The voice laughed, a sound that rattled Daniel's bones. "He is not yours," it said again, and for the first time, Daniel wondered if the voice was protecting him or leading him deeper into the dark. As Thomas chanted alone, Daniel's eyes drifted to the altar, to the photograph of his mother, and a memory stirred, one he'd buried long ago, one that might hold the key to the voice's true nature. The blizzard that gripped Baltimore in late December 1994 turned Pratt Street into a frozen labyrinth, but inside Daniel Carver's row house, the heat of his obsession burned hotter than ever. The air was thick with the stench of melted wax and the strange, bitter herbs Thomas Reed insisted on burning. The altar, now a sprawling chaos of relics and papers, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its candles casting shadows that twisted like living things. Daniel knelt before it, his body frail, his arms scarred with crosses, his eyes fixed on the photograph of his mother, its edges curled from the heat. The voice in his head was a relentless tide, its latest command, "He is not yours," echoing with a fury that made his head throb. Thomas, kneeling beside him, chanted in a low, fervent tone, but Daniel's doubt had taken root, fed by the memory that had stirred the night he refused the vial. Something from his past, long buried, was clawing its way to the surface, and it terrified him more than the voice itself. The memory was fleeting at first, a fragment from his childhood in the late 1960s. He was 9, maybe 10, standing in the kitchen of their old house in Dundalk, watching his mother, Ellen, knead dough for Sunday bread. Her hands moved with a quiet grace, but her eyes were distant, her lips muttering words he couldn't hear. She'd always been devout, her rosary a constant companion, but that day she'd stopped mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window. "They're watching," she'd whispered, and Daniel, too young to understand, had laughed, thinking it a game. But her face had darkened, and she'd grabbed his hand, her grip tight. "Never let them in, Danny," she'd said, her voice urgent. He'd forgotten that moment, buried it under years of routine and grief after her death when he was 16. But now, staring at her photograph, the memory felt alive, as if her words were a warning meant for this moment, for Thomas, for the voice. Thomas sensed the shift in Daniel. "You're wavering," he said one night, his voice sharp as he lit another bundle of herbs. The smoke stung Daniel's eyes, but he didn't blink. His gaze locked on Thomas's hands, too steady, too sure. "The demon's fighting back," Thomas insisted, but Daniel's mind was elsewhere, replaying his mother's voice, her fear. He began to notice things about Thomas, the way he avoided questions about his past, the way his prayers sometimes slipped into words Daniel didn't recognize, not Latin, not English, but something older, stranger. The voice in Daniel's head grew louder in Thomas's presence, its warnings more specific. "He wants your soul." Daniel's hands shook as he clutched his rosary, torn between the man who claimed to be his ally and the voice he'd believed was God's. Was Thomas a guide, or was he the demon the voice warned of? Outside, the world was pressing closer. Marie, Father Brennan, Father Michael, and Dr. Voss had formed a fragile alliance, meeting daily to plan their intervention. Dr. Voss had reviewed Marie's notes and suggested a diagnosis: schizophrenia with religious delusions, likely triggered by unresolved trauma. She urged them to act quickly, warning that Daniel's isolation and fasting could push him past recovery. Marie, clutching a childhood photo of her and Daniel, nodded but couldn't shake the fear that this was more than illness. Father Brennan, torn between faith and reason, agreed to try a spiritual approach first, hoping to reach Daniel through prayer. Father Michael, more skeptical, pushed for psychiatric intervention, but all four knew they had to get inside the house. They planned to visit the next day, armed with a letter from the diocese and a referral to a psychiatric hospital. Clara Hensley, the reporter, was circling closer too. She'd tracked down Thomas's name through a contact at a homeless shelter, learning he'd been in Baltimore only a month with no clear history before that. Her notes were a tangle of theories. Was Thomas a con man, a zealot, or something worse? She'd seen him leave Daniel's house at odd hours, carrying a small bag that clinked like glass. She followed him once, losing him in the snowy alleys near the docks. But her instincts screamed that he was the key to Daniel's unraveling. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was on edge. The petition Mr. Ruiz had started gained traction, and a health inspector was scheduled to visit after the holidays. Whispers of cult and madman spread, and some neighbors swore they heard two voices chanting now, not one. Inside, Daniel's memory of his mother grew sharper. He recalled another moment, a year before her death, when she'd locked herself in her room for days, praying loudly, her voice rising and falling like a storm. When she'd emerged, she'd looked at Daniel with eyes full of sorrow. "It speaks to me, Danny," she'd said, "but it's not God." He'd been too young to understand, but now, kneeling before the altar, the words hit him like a blow. Had his mother heard the same voice? Was it her warning, not God's command, that echoed in his mind? As Thomas chanted beside him, Daniel's doubt became a scream, and he stood, his voice cutting through the smoke. "Who are you?" he demanded, his eyes wild. Thomas froze, his smile faltering, and for a moment the house was silent, except for the voice in Daniel's head, laughing, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The last day of December 1994 dawned in Baltimore with a brittle clarity, the snow-packed streets gleaming under a rare winter sun. Inside Daniel Carver's row house, the air was a haze of smoke and desperation, the altar a chaotic shrine that seemed to breathe with the weight of his torment. Daniel stood frozen, his question, "Who are you?" still hanging in the air, his eyes locked on Thomas Reed. The drifter's smile had vanished, replaced by a flicker of something, anger, fear, or perhaps something darker, that made Daniel's heart lurch. The voice in his head roared, "He is the deceiver." But for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure who to trust. The voice he'd believed was God's, or the man who'd promised to save him. The memory of his mother's warning, "It's not God," burned in his mind, a lifeline in the chaos. Outside, the world was about to collide with Daniel's private war, as those who loved him prepared to storm the fortress of his delusion. Marie, Father Brennan, Father Michael, and Dr. Helen Voss stood outside Daniel's door, their breath clouding in the cold. Marie clutched a childhood photo of her and Daniel, her knuckles white, while Father Brennan held a letter from the diocese, urging Daniel to accept help. Dr. Voss carried a referral for a psychiatric evaluation, her calm demeanor masking her concern about Daniel's deteriorating state. Father Michael, the skeptic, had insisted on bringing a police officer, but Marie refused. She didn't want Daniel dragged away in cuffs. "He's not a criminal," she'd said, her voice breaking. They'd agreed to try talking first, to appeal to the brother, the parishioner, the man they'd known before the voice took hold. As they knocked, the faint sound of chanting leaked through the door. Two voices now, intertwined in a rhythm that felt wrong, unnatural. Inside, Thomas recovered quickly, his voice smooth as he stepped closer to Daniel. "You're tired, brother," he said, his hand reaching out, but Daniel flinched, backing toward the altar. "You said you'd faced demons before," Daniel said, his voice trembling but firm. "Tell me how. Tell me who you are." Thomas's eyes narrowed, but he began a story of a preacher in Kansas, a woman in Louisiana, tales Daniel had heard before but now sounded rehearsed, hollow. The voice in Daniel's head screamed, "Lies," and he clutched his rosary, his mother's words echoing, "Never let them in." He didn't know if them was Thomas, the voice, or both, but the doubt was a knife, cutting through his faith. Before Thomas could finish, the knocking grew louder, insistent, and Marie's voice pierced the haze. "Danny, please, it's me." Daniel froze, his gaze darting to the door. Thomas grabbed his arm, his grip tight. "They'll stop you," he hissed. "They don't believe." But Daniel pulled free, stumbling toward the door, the voice in his head now a cacophony, shouting, "Betrayer!" He opened the door a crack, and Marie's face, pale, tear-streaked, filled the gap. "Danny, let us in," she pleaded. Behind her, Father Brennan's gentle eyes met his, while Dr. Voss and Father Michael stood back, their expressions unreadable. Daniel hesitated, the voice screaming, but his sister's voice, soft and familiar, was a tether to the world he'd lost. He opened the door wider, and they stepped inside, gasping at the sight. The altar, the candles, the blood-streaked rosary. Thomas stood by the altar, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with something fierce. Marie rushed to Daniel, touching his gaunt face, but he flinched, his eyes darting to Thomas. "Who's this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Thomas introduced himself as a friend in faith, but Dr. Voss stepped forward, her voice steady. "Daniel, we're here to help. You're not well." The voice in Daniel's head roared, "They lie," but his mother's memory flashed again. Her fear, her warning. Father Brennan began to pray softly, a familiar litany, but Thomas interrupted, his voice rising in a chant that drowned out the priest's words. The room felt charged, as if the air itself were tightening. Daniel's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, clutching his head. "It's not God," he whispered, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Marie knelt beside him, tears streaming, while Dr. Voss watched Thomas, her instincts screaming that he was no ally. The confrontation escalated as Thomas stepped forward, his voice booming with a prayer that sounded more like a curse. Father Michael grabbed his arm, demanding he stop, but Thomas shook him off, his eyes locked on Daniel. "You're close, brother," he said, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "Don't let them pull you away." Marie shouted at Thomas to leave, her fear turning to anger, but Daniel's voice cut through, weak but clear. "Was it you?" he asked Thomas, his eyes wide. "Did you bring it here?" The room fell silent, the question hanging like a blade. Thomas's face twitched, and for a moment something passed between them, a truth or a lie that would soon unravel everything. Outside, Clara Hensley watched from her car, her pen frozen over her notepad, sensing the moment she'd been waiting for was about to break. The air in Daniel Carver's row house was electric with tension on that final day of 1994, the candles flickering as if stirred by an unseen breath. Daniel knelt on the floor, his gaunt frame trembling, his eyes locked on Thomas Reed as he whispered, "Was it you? Did you bring it here?" The question hung like a guillotine, cutting through the chaos of chants and prayers. Marie clutched her brother's arm, her heart pounding, while Father Brennan and Father Michael flanked Thomas, their faces a mix of fear and resolve. Dr. Helen Voss stood near the door, her clinical gaze fixed on Thomas, sensing a danger she couldn't yet name. The voice in Daniel's head was a storm now, screaming, "Betrayer! Deceiver!" But his mother's warning, "It's not God," echoed louder, a beacon in the fog of his torment. Outside, the winter sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the gaps in the tattered blankets over the windows, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Thomas's calm facade cracked, his eyes darting between Daniel and the others. "You're confused, brother," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "The demon's twisting your mind." But Daniel's doubt had hardened into certainty. The memory of his mother, her fear, her whispered warnings, had unlocked something, a truth he'd buried under years of grief. "My mother heard it too," he said, his voice breaking. "She said it wasn't God. Was it you, Thomas? Did you bring this voice to me?" Marie gasped, her hand tightening on Daniel's arm, while Father Brennan's prayers faltered, his eyes wide with realization. Thomas stepped back, his hands raised, but Dr. Voss spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "Who are you, Thomas? What do you want with him?" The room seemed to tighten as Thomas's story unraveled. He stammered, his tales of demons and preachers faltering under scrutiny. Father Michael, his patience gone, grabbed Thomas's bag from the altar, spilling its contents. Vials of dark liquid, strange herbs, a notebook filled with names and dates, none of them Daniel's. "What is this?" Father Michael demanded, holding up a vial. Thomas lunged for it, but Father Brennan blocked him, his voice firm. "Enough. Tell us the truth." Cornered, Thomas's mask fell. "I'm helping him," he spat, but his eyes betrayed panic. Dr. Voss, piecing it together, stepped forward. "You're no healer," she said. "You're feeding his delusions, keeping him trapped." She turned to Daniel, her voice gentle but urgent. Daniel, this isn't God. It's your mind, and we can help you. Daniel's world tilted. The voice screamed, but his mother's words were louder now, a lifeline pulling him back. He remembered her final days, her frantic prayers, the way she'd locked herself away, whispering of voices that weren't divine. She'd died of a heart attack, the doctors said, but Daniel now wondered if she'd been fighting the same battle, driven to collapse by a voice she couldn't silence. "It was you," he said to Thomas, his voice steady for the first time in months. "You made it worse." Thomas's face twisted and he lunged for the door, but Father Michael grabbed him, pinning him against the wall. "You're not leaving," he said, as Marie knelt beside Daniel, tears streaming down her face. Clara Hensley, watching from her car, saw the commotion through the window and scribbled furiously, her instincts screaming that the story was breaking open. Inside, Thomas's confession came in fragments. He wasn't a drifter by chance. He sought out the vulnerable, those teetering on the edge of faith and madness, feeding their fears with rituals and stories. He'd done it before, in other towns, other lives, leaving chaos in his wake. Whether he believed his own tales or was a calculated manipulator, no one could say, but his presence had amplified Daniel's torment, turning a fragile mind into a battlefield. Dr. Voss took charge, urging Marie to call for help. "He needs a hospital," she said, her voice calm but firm. Marie nodded, dialing 911 while Father Brennan began a prayer, not for exorcism, but for peace. Daniel collapsed, his body too weak to stand, the voice still raging but weaker now, as if Thomas's exposure had sapped its power. He clung to Marie, whispering, "I'm sorry," as the sound of sirens grew closer. The altar's candles flickered out, one by one, as if the house itself were exhaling. Thomas was restrained, his protests fading as the police arrived, alerted by Clara's call after she'd seen the struggle. The neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights, gathered outside, their fear giving way to relief and curiosity. Daniel was carried out on a stretcher, his eyes half open, searching the faces around him for answers. As the ambulance doors closed, Marie clutched his hand, promising to stay, while Father Brennan prayed silently, wondering if they'd saved a soul or merely delayed its fall. The ambulance lights faded into the snowy Baltimore night of December 31st, 1994, carrying Daniel Carver away from the row house that had become his prison. The altar, with its melted candles and scattered relics, stood silent, a relic of a war fought in the shadows of a fractured mind. Daniel was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where Dr. Helen Voss oversaw his treatment, diagnosing schizophrenia exacerbated by religious trauma. The voice that had tormented him, once a deafening roar, began to fade under medication and therapy, though it never fully vanished. Thomas Reed disappeared after that night, slipping away before the police could hold him, his notebook of names and rituals the only trace of his strange predatory mission. Marie stayed by Daniel's side, her love a tether that pulled him back, inch by inch, from the abyss. Father Brennan prayed for him daily, wrestling with the question of whether Daniel's torment was divine or delusion, while Clara Hensley's story, published in a local paper, sparked whispers that lingered in Baltimore for years. But the truth of what happened in that row house remains a shadow, a puzzle with pieces missing, a story that asks more questions than it answers. What drove Daniel Carver to the edge? Was it the weight of his mother's own unspoken battle, echoing through time to haunt her son? Was it Thomas, a manipulator who preyed on faith? Or was it something deeper, something that lives in the fragile corners of the human mind, where belief and fear collide? This story isn't just about one man's descent. It's a mirror held up to all of us, reflecting the thin line between devotion and madness, between the voices we trust and the ones we should fear. Daniel's rituals, his desperate chants, his blood-streaked rosary, they were cries for salvation. But from what? A demon within, a memory buried, or a world that couldn't reach him in time? His journey forces us to confront the unsettling truth. The human mind is a labyrinth, and sometimes the monsters we fight are the ones we create ourselves. You who've stayed until the end are part of a rare group, those who dare to peer into the darkness to ask the questions that keep others awake at night. You've walked with Daniel through his torment, felt the weight of his doubt, the chill of his fear. Congratulations for not turning away, for facing the enigma of a man who heard God's commands and found himself lost in a war he couldn't win alone. Your courage to follow this story makes you one of us, a seeker of the hidden, the strange, the truths that lie buried beneath the surface of the everyday. Now let's make that connection deeper. In the comments below, share the phrase, "This story showed me the shadows in faith." By doing so, you're not just leaving a comment, you're marking yourself as one of the committed, the ones who aren't afraid to confront the inexplicable. Your words will resonate with others, building a community bound by the pursuit of stories no one else dares to tell. But don't stop there. This story, like a whisper in the dark, deserves to spread. Share this video with someone who feels the pull of the unknown, who craves the chill of a mystery that lingers long after the screen fades. By sharing, you're opening a door, letting others step into the unsettling world we've uncovered together. Think of it as casting a light into the shadows, revealing what hides in plain sight. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Join us in this relentless search for the stories that haunt, the ones that cling to your thoughts like fog on a winter night. Subscribing isn't just a click, it's a pledge to stand with us, to keep your curiosity alive, to chase the truths that others turn away from. Every video we create is a step deeper into the labyrinth of the human mind, and we need you with us to uncover what lies at its heart. Daniel Carver's story is a reminder. The voices we hear, the beliefs we hold, can be both our salvation and our undoing. His row house may stand empty now, but its echoes remain, asking us to look within, to question what we trust, and to wonder what might be whispering in the silence. Keep watching, keep seeking, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see the world, or yourself, forever.